is seeping in because you guys were not superstars on this one. In fact, the first class, section 1, is better. Not to say that we didn't have some people who did really well, but as a class, we need to pick up our game. All right.
Sarah was so surprised.
Today, we're going to talk about the cranial nerves. There are a total of 12 cranial nerves. When we talk about the cranial nerves, we can either refer to them by Roman numeral or by their proper name. So a more proper way would be to use the Roman numerals here. Okay? This is a list of simply what the various cranial nerves do. For instance, cranial nerve 1, the only thing it does is smell. And so, as we'll see, it's called the olfactory nerve. Cranial nerve 2, the only thing it does is see. And so it's called the optic nerve. When you read about cranial nerves, they will always group 3, 4, and 6 together, because these are the nerves that innervate the extraocular muscles, the muscles that move the eyes. Okay? And they tend to travel together. So 3, 4, and 6 will always be linked together. Now, 4 and 6 only do one thing. They only innervate each one of the muscles, the extraocular muscles that move the eye. 3 does more, as we'll see. So when we talk about 3, 4, and 6, we'll tackle 4 and 6 first, and we'll come back and pick up 3. 5, you're already familiar with. 5 is the largest of the cranial nerves. It's called the trigeminal. Okay? Its 3 divisions are referred to as the ophthalmic division, the maxillary division, and the mandibular division.
Is that the one that passes through Ross?
It passes the ophthalmic division, passes through the superior orbital fissure, the maxillary through the rotundum, mandibular ovale. And they do this. In other words, each division feels a part of the face or scalp. So it feels the face, but also it's important in mastication. The mandibular division innervates the muscles of mastication. Okay. So that takes us through the first 6. 7 is the famous facial nerve. It's called the facial nerve because it innervates the muscles of facial expression. So it allows you to appear surprised or angry or tearful. Okay. It also provides innervation for the anterior 2/3 of the tongue and taste. It salivates, meaning that it innervates salivary glands, and it lacrimates. It innervates the lacrimal glands. So taste, salivates, and lacrimates. Oh my. 7 and 8 are sometimes grouped together. Why? Why would 7 and 8 be grouped together? Because they both pass through the internal acoustic meatus. So they originate from the brainstem close to each other, and they both, as they exit, pass through the internal acoustic meatus. Now, cranial nerve 8 stays within the petrous portion of the temporal bone because that's where the inner ear is located, whereas 7 keeps on going. 8 mediates hearing and balance, or equilibrium. It's going to be called the vestibular cochlear nerve. Okay, 9, 10, and 11 will always be grouped together. Why? Because they exit the cranial cavity through the jugular foramen. Nine also participates in taste and salivation. It's called the glossopharyngeal nerve. and we're going to mention the names formally, but glossopharyngeal means tongue pharynx, tongue throat. And so the tongue part is the fact that it mediates taste for the posterior third of the tongue. We said that the facial nerve 7 handles taste for the anterior 2/3. The posterior third is picked up from the glossopharyngeal. Just like 7, it innervates at least a pair of salivary glands. What about the pharyngeal part? It innervates the muscles involved in swallowing. Now, this part, this role in these carotid reflexes, we'll get to that in A&P 2. We're not going to talk much about that. Again, 9, 10, 11 are grouped together. 10 is my favorite of the cranial nerves. It's called the vagus. Vagus comes from the Latin for wanderer. It's the wanderer. It's the only cranial nerve bold enough to leave the head and neck. It wanders down into the chest cavity and the abdomen to provide innervation for viscera in those cavities. Okay? Now, so it communicates to and from, it carries motor fibers to the viscera within the thorax and abdomen, but also carries sensory fibers for these organs. Okay? It participates in swallowing, but also in speech. It innervates the muscles of the larynx. 11 is called the accessory nerve. It turns the head and shrugs the shoulders. Accessory. And then finally 12 is the hypoglossal because it provides somatic motor innervation of the tongue. It allows you to move your tongue. That's a basic rundown. We've mentioned, I think, before that all cranial nerves emanate from the brainstem. Did we talk about the rule of 4s?
No. Oh, we mentioned it, but like it was only in passing.
Yeah, this is the best way of thinking of it. The first 4 cranial nerves emanate from the midbrain. 5 through 8, 5, 6, 7, and 8 from the pons. And 9, 10, and 11, well, 9, 10, 11, and 12 from the medulla oblongata. A very important fact about the cranial nerves is this. They may carry sensory fibers. They may carry somatic motor fibers. They may carry parasympathetic autonomic fibers, but they will not carry sympathetic autonomic motor fibers. Another name for the parasympathetic division of the autonomic nervous system is the craniosacral division. Okay. Because those parasympathetic neurons are located either within the brainstem and carried by cranial nerves, or their nuclei are located in the sacral portion of the spinal cord. Hence, craniosacral division. But cranial nerves do not, and will not, and cannot carry sympathetic axons. If it's autonomic, it has to be parasympathetic. Okay?
What does carry the sympathetic axons?
Well, those are not carried by cranial nerves. Those are carried by peripheral nerves.
Okay.
Their nuclei are located either in the thoracic or lumbar region of the spinal cord,
Okay.
but not in the brainstem.
Okay.
Okay. So this shows in yellow the various cranial nerves as they emerge from the brainstem. Now, some of these cranial nerves are purely sensory. Yeah. For instance, the first 2, olfactory and optic, they only carry sensory fibers. Or cranial nerve number 8, the vestibulocochlear, for hearing. It's purely sensory. Some of them are purely motor. Okay, like the hypoglossal that moves the tongue. Purely motor. And then some of the cranial nerves are mixed, meaning that they carry both motor, and sensory fibers. If you look at this little chart, it tells you which ones, for instance, are purely sensory, like the first two, the olfactory and the optic. Sensory function, yes, yes. Motor function or parasympathetic, no, no. Okay? Now, an easy way to remember this is this little mnemonic. Some say marry money, but my brother says big brains matter more. I've altered this a little bit.
Big business.
No.
Oh, well, that's another alteration.
I don't think that's what.
But I don't think that's what the original is. So, some say marry money, meaning that if you're going to get married, marry someone with money. But my brother says big brains, in other words, marrying someone intelligent, is more important. Matters more. So how does that fit in? The S stands for sensory. M stands for motor. If the word begins with a B, like brother, it means that it carries both sensory and motor fibers. So let's look at these 12 cranial nerves. Some say, so the first two are purely sensory, marry money. Okay, that means the next two are purely motor. But, meaning cranial nerve 5 has both. But my brother says big brains matter more. So in a pinch, if you're trying to remember all the functions of a particular cranial nerve and you're not sure if it has some sensory function also, use that mnemonic.
Oh, you get it now, Colin. Good job.
I got it, but like,
Okay.
I understood like mine didn't make sense.
You know, Colin thinks more in terms of business.
No, I don't think he
don't
does. I
really.
actually think that's a lie.
No.
It's all a fake.
All right, now, I mentioned earlier that all of the 12 cranial nerves have a proper name. Okay, and the more you hear them, the more it starts to stick. So it would be olfactory, optic, oculomotor, trochlear, trigeminal, abducens, facial, vestibular, cochlear, glossopharyngeal, vagus, accessory, and hypoglossal. Yes.
Do you have a preference on which ones you would rather, like CN1 or?
No,
would
what
you
you're
rather
gonna have to
like
do-
Factory.
What you're going to have to do is memorize both by Roman numeral and proper name.
Okay.
Now, the way you're going to do this is Google cranial nerve mnemonics. And there's a whole slew of different cranial nerve mnemonics that will help you initially to learn the 12 cranial nerves. After a while, after you've repeated it so many times, you don't have to use the mnemonic anymore. It's embedded. Okay? You're going to find a mnemonic that works best for you. Like in that other mnemonic, business works well for you,
No. I mean,
and brains work well for me. Okay? It depends upon who you are.
Jordan, what works for you?
I only knew that because of that girl that told us that it was going to be dirty.
Now, you'll find that some of the mnemonics, and I'm going to say ahead of time, are a little bit naughty. Okay? If it works for you, then just embrace it.
What if we don't need a mnemonic?
Then you're fine.
I'd rather just like memorize.
But what you'll find is that in nursing school and in medical school, people tend to gravitate toward
Mnemonics.
I'll remember the mnemonic
the
and
more
then I
naughty
don't.
mnemonics, the
I re-
ones that are not as appropriate. Right. What you'll find also is that a lot of times these mnemonics will begin with something like, oh, oh, oh.
Oh, I've heard that one.
Okay.
Yeah.
But multiple mnemonics begin with oh, oh, oh. You know? It's almost like a rap. Oh, oh, oh. You know, yo, yo, yo. The OO stands for what? Olfactory, optic, and oculomotor. Okay? So the mnemonic will help you to remember, at least in beginning to learn your cranial nerves. Okay? So now we're going to break it down. We mentioned that cranial nerve 1 is the olfactory nerve. This is the only one that's not routinely tested. In other words, When you perform a neurologic exam on a patient, part of that neurologic exam is examining the cranial nerves, or cranial nerve function. But when you do so routinely, you start with cranial nerve 2 and you go through 12. Unless there's an indication, you don't test cranial nerve 1. If someone had a facial fracture, you may test it, but otherwise, unlikely. Now, the olfactory nerve is made up of axons that are part of bipolar neurons. Remember when we first talked about the structural classification of neurons, we said that bipolar neurons are reserved for special sensations. Well, olfaction, vision, and hearing are those special sensations. So these are bipolar neurons embedded within the olfactory mucosa. That's the mucous membrane that lines the roof of the nasal cavity. Embedded within it are olfactory nerve cells, which are really bipolar neurons. And along the dendrites of those neurons are receptors for odorants that allow for smell. When odorants attach to those receptors, it may trigger action potentials. And those action potentials are going to be carried by these axons that are passing through the olfactory foramina, present within the cribriform plates. So, on either side of this ethmoid bone, this group of axons passing through olfactory foramina make up the olfactory nerve. So you have a right and left olfactory nerve. Now, these axons are going to synapse with second order neurons, or secondary neurons, located within the olfactory bulb. Axons of these secondary neurons will be carried by the olfactory tract toward the brain. Okay. Does that make sense to everyone?